Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Memories and Motherhood by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. New York, the 16th August, 1868. Bessie Cameron sat on the cold wooden bench, the sun in her face and a glow in her heart. As she looked out across Central Park to where her husband Carl and her daughter Caroline played together happily on the grass nearby, she felt deeply thankful for all that she had. At 29 years of age, she was blessed with a happy marriage. She and Carl had met when they were just 17. He had been working on the railroads when she met him. Bessie enjoyed watching the trains and had spent much of her time around the railroads. She recalled the moment she spotted him. It had been a crowded platform, and she had been enjoying watching the people come and go and viewing the locomotions. Their eyes had met, and she had felt an electric current through her body as she shyly smiled back at his grinning face. She had lowered her eyes quickly, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks, and had scurried away back to her parents' home. After avoiding the train station for a few weeks, Bessie could wait no longer. During the 2 weeks since she had seen him, she had thought of little else, and whenever she thought about him, it sent shivers down her spine. One cold fall morning, she plucked up the courage to go back, as she had done many times before, to sit on the platform and watch the trains go by. She had walked to the station feeling nervous and excited by potentially seeing the man again. She had been able to tell from his clothing that he was working on the railroad, so it was likely that she might see him there again, she had thought. Now, Bessie smiled as she thought back to how she had taken so much time to get ready before she'd gone to the platform that day. She knew she had fallen in love the first time she saw him, and the second time she prepared to see him, she made sure she looked as beautiful as possible. She had got up early that morning and had taken time to do her hair and make sure her face looked as pleasant as could be. She had dressed in her finest clothing before setting out on her long journey. The pair's eyes had met again across the train station platform. They both smiled simultaneously, and much to her horror and delight, he approached her immediately. "You are here," he had declared gleefully. Her brow had started to furrow, confused by what he had said. "I have been hoping to see you again. You were in a hurry last time, so I didn't have the opportunity to come by and introduce myself." She was bewitched by his smile. "My name is Carl. It's very nice to make your acquaintance." "Hello, Carl," she responded shyly, her eyes fluttered to the ground in what she hoped appeared flirtatious, although this was all very new to her. "It is very nice to meet you, too. And what might I call you?" he asked politely. His green eyes sparkled as the daylight hit them. "My name is Bessie." "Well, hello, Bessie. What a beautiful name. Are you taking a journey today?" "Heavens, no. I just like to come and sit and watch the trains." She had felt nervous about his reaction and quickly added, "That must seem odd, actually." "Not at all," he had replied promptly, reassuringly. "It is one of my favorite places to be. I love to watch all the people and the trains go by." He had noticed her look down at his clothing. "That was one of the biggest reasons that I started working here, to be honest." He winked at her. "Well, then I am sure we shall see each other a great deal." She had instantly regretted saying it and thought herself too forward. "I am counting on it, Bessie," he had replied as she blushed coyly. "I have a train coming in now, so I need to move along. Will I see you again once this train has unloaded, refilled, and departed? If you would like to, I can wait." "I am not in any rush," she had replied honestly. She had hoped not to sound desperate. From that moment onwards, Bessie and Carl had been inseparable. They both loved living in New York, enjoyed spending time in Central Park, walking and cycling together. They were a handsome couple, he tall, dark, athletic, she petite, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. Both their parents had approved of their relationship and were not surprised when they announced their engagement just 6 months after meeting. They had a short engagement and exchanged their wedding vows on the anniversary of the first day they had met, which had seemed fitting and romantic to them. For the first few years of their married life, Carl had moved from job to job and worked in many warehouses, but settled on working on the dock site where he seemed most comfortable. They had a modest home in a small tenement block, like most of the working class of the area, and there wasn't much money, but Bessie kept it as nice as could be, and when they were both aged 21, they had been blessed with their daughter Caroline, now 8 years old. They had been together now for 12 years, and since the birth of Caroline, they had not been blessed with another child. Until now. Bessie had fallen pregnant at the beginning of the year. She caressed her ever-expanding stomach as she sat on the cold bench watching her family and looking forward to the new arrival, due in just a few months. Bessie had never been particularly girly, hence her interest in trains. Her mother had never been one to play with her, so she had spent most of her childhood with her father and consequently shared his interests. But as she watched her daughter play with her husband, she marveled at her independent daughter's choice of toys and clothing. She loved to wear frilly dresses and play with girls' toys. Caroline had pleaded with them both to have a sister to play with, and it had been breaking their hearts year on year to not be able to grant this wish for their daughter and them. So, when they had found she was with child, they were all elated, none more so than their daughter. Caroline was insistent that the baby was to be a girl, and they tried to explain that they could not determine this, and that they would be happy no matter what. She ignored her parents' advice and continued in the hope to tell everyone who would listen that she was going to have a baby sister. The last few weeks had been unbearably hot, the summer sun beating down on them relentlessly. So, the once busy family had been restricted to the house to keep Bessie cool and to protect the baby. Today, though, had started out a little cooler with some clouds in the sky, and so they had decided to go for a walk in Central Park. As the day progressed, the sun had peeked out from behind the clouds and had warmed the earth once more. Bessie's heavily pregnant physique had struggled to cope with this, so she had been forced to sit this one out and just watch Carl and Caroline play from the sidelines. She was not too content to do so, as it reminded her of the walks she had taken with her own mother when she was a child. But she reminded herself that her mother just did not want to join in and have fun, which was very different from her current situation. She loved nothing more than watching her family. She was so proud of everything they had achieved so far and how bonded they were as a family unit, just as hers had been when she was growing up. Chapter 2. "Look, Caroline, Mommy's watching us. Shall we go join her?" Carl asked his daughter. She was busy in her play and politely asked him to wait a moment. As he waited, he looked at his wife. He sometimes found it hard to believe the life they had built together. It almost felt too good to be true. He had never seen a happy marriage. His parents had not been compatible, although they had stayed together, much to the detriment of everyone around them, and it was only death that would separate them in the end. His parents' volatile relationship had meant he had sought to work as soon as he could so that he could be independent and leave the family home. And this is how he had found himself working at the train station where he had first met his beloved wife. He thought back now to what could have been if he had not been working there and had not met Bessie. He would be nothing without her. While he waited for Caroline, he allowed himself the luxury of thinking back to their wedding day. She had looked so beautiful, even more so than normal. It had been a small gathering with only 2 close friends, one for each of them, and their parents. Following the small ceremony, they all parted ways and went about their day as normal, except for him and Bessie, who set about turning his modest home into their own. He recalled how much fun they had together that afternoon as they set up their new home, and they talked about what their future would likely bring. He still felt the familiar surge of love every time he looked at her, and he knew she felt the same. They understood they were both very fortunate to have married their best friend, and with their new little one on the way, they would have everything they wanted. He adored being a parent and took the responsibility seriously. He had learned his lessons from his own father, who had thought that working all hours and providing money and food was his sole responsibility as a father. Carl had never really known love from his father, and certainly never any affection. He knew that is not how he wanted to be remembered by his children. He wanted them to know that he loved them and that they could go to him with any problems, and he would always be there. Since becoming a father, he had found nothing more enjoyable than spending time with his wife and daughter. They loved each other's company and enjoyed spending time together. He knew this could change for children as they got older, so he wanted to make the most of it with Caroline while she was still young enough. He watched his daughter in her play, marveling at what the two of them had created. She had been blessed with her mother's beauty and her father's adventurous spirit. His thoughts again wandered to the future, with nervous anticipation of what it would hold for him and his daughter. He knew there would come a time when she would not need him this much, and particularly a time when she would meet the man she would marry. He knew this was a good while off, but it filled him with dread regardless. He wished she could remain his little girl forever. Carl's attention was brought back to Caroline as she proudly announced that she had finished. He helped his daughter to her feet, and they raced across the grass to the bench on which Bessie was sitting. They laughed together as they approached, with him slowing to let his daughter win the race again. As they neared his wife, she smiled at them. He returned her smile eagerly and sat next to her on the bench, placing his arm around her shoulders protectively. She snuggled into the crook of his shoulder and placed her head on his chest with a contented sigh. "Mommy, Mommy, look what we made," their daughter exclaimed as she held the daisy chain up that she had worked hard on creating for her. "Oh, my darling, that is just beautiful. You two are very clever." "It's for you," Caroline announced as she stepped up onto the bench next to her mother and placed the daisy chain over her head and around her neck. Carl watched as the pair shared a precious moment. They sat together for a short while on the bench to enjoy the sunshine and the cool breeze. Caroline pointed out every baby they saw, reminding them just how excited she was about having a new baby sister soon. He suggested they should call it a day and make their way home before the midday heat. In his customary gentlemanly fashion, he stood in front of his wife and held his hands out to help her to her feet. She gratefully reached out and held both of his hands as she smiled into his gentle green eyes. Their daughter was straight to her feet, jumping up and down, full of energy and ready to go. They would now have a short walk to their horse and cart before making their way back home. He knew his daughter would be halfway back to the cart before they even turned the corner, but Caroline knew not to go too far and would stay in sight. He would stay back with his darling wife and support her as they walked under the intensifying midday heat. He knew it was becoming more uncomfortable for her now, although she would never complain. As Bessie rose to her feet, supported by her husband, he saw her beautiful face distort as a look of panic and horror replaced the smile and sparkling blue eyes from a moment before. "What is it?" he asked quickly, panic rising. He did not need to wait for the answer. He heard and felt his wife's waters burst. They clung to each other whilst he shouted for someone nearby to get help. It was too early for the baby to come, but it looked like he or she was indeed on the way. He noticed Caroline running back, her face puzzled and bewildered. As she got closer, she started to cry, feeling the emotion in the air as she frantically searched around them for people to help. Carl held his hand out to her to beckon that she could stand with them, which she did quickly and quietly. He tried to reassure his darling wife as he helped her to sit back down on the bench behind her, telling her it would be fine and that they would soon have help. He hoped he looked and sounded calm as he wanted to be strong for his wife and daughter, but inside he was filled with fear and dread. He regretted bringing his family out today and wished he had trusted his instincts that it was too hot and they should stay home. But it was too late now. The baby was coming, and it was far too early. Chapter 3. Her heart hurt. It was a physical pain that took her breath away at times. She felt as though she was not able to take a full breath. Maybe she didn't deserve to take a full breath. Why had she not stayed in that day? Why had she been so stubborn and talked Carl into taking them all to the park? If they had stayed home, or if she had stayed home and let them go and have fun, things would be so different. Maybe. "Mummy, may I have a cuddle?" asked Caroline, with some trepidation, she noticed. She knew she had not been the most approachable recently. She held out her arms to gesture that she was welcome to come for a cuddle, and her grateful daughter ran into them eagerly. They held each other tightly, her tiny arms around her mother's frail neck. After a while, Caroline readjusted herself to sit on her mother's knee, and they sat together, comforting one another. "Why did my sister have to leave, Mummy?" she asked as she looked innocently into her mother's eyes. It broke Bessie's heart even more to hear this question from her daughter. But she was helpless. She had no answers and could only cry in response. "Sometimes babies are too good for this world, Caroline." She heard her husband's response, although she could not see him for the tears that were blinding her. "Your sister was taken to heaven and will be watching over us, but she will always be with us, in here." He had gestured to his chest to indicate their hearts. Bessie wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and saw the tears in her husband's eyes. She knew he was trying to be brave for them and trying to be positive, but she could not help but feel angry at the words he spoke to their daughter. She felt angry with the world that her baby girl had been snatched away from them only moments after her birth. They had no time with the baby, who they had called Lucy, and she felt cheated and bereft. She knew that her role as a mother was to make sure that her daughter was well, but she didn't have the strength right now. She gently ushered the little girl off her knee and got to her feet. She fought her desire to show anger towards her husband and chose to silently leave the room instead, with a furious glance in his direction. She took the stairs quickly, desperate suddenly for fresh air in her lungs. She could hear Carl reassuring Caroline that she just needed some more time alone, but that she would be back soon. As she threw herself through the blocked doors and rushed to the bench beside the shrubs, she heard her own sobs and felt her body involuntarily shaking. She could not let her family see her like this. They had all been so looking forward to the newest addition to their family. Bessie felt as though she had ruined that for them. She blamed herself and knew that if they didn't now, they would eventually blame her too. It had only been a week since that fateful day, although it felt like a lifetime to her. They didn't have much money, which meant that Carl had not been able to take time off work. She had therefore spent much of her time alone with Caroline, who constantly asked questions about her sister or cried. It was often too much for Bessie to bear, and she would have to take herself off to her bed, where she would cry herself to sleep for a fretful few hours. Bessie needed answers. When she had arrived at the hospital, she had seen the grave faces of the medical staff around her. She had been on the verge of hysterics, the fear of losing their baby becoming too much for her. It had felt as though she was watching someone else as her baby was brought into the world, whimpered slightly, and was then whisked away. A short while later, a nurse had told them that their baby had died. Prosent. Later that same day, as if in a trance, the three had left the hospital without the much-anticipated and loved bundle of joy. Since that day, her heart had been shattered into a million pieces. She wanted to be there for Carl and Caroline, but she could barely support herself right now, let alone them. Her parents had been to visit them, which had only made matters worse, which she had not thought possible. They avoided any mention of their baby and acted as though everything was normal. She hadn't wanted to see anybody and felt immediately frustrated by their presence and their ignorance over the whole sorry situation. They had left shortly after they had arrived, clearly as uncomfortable as she had been with their presence. What had Carl been thinking when he had agreed for them to come? Bessie was unsure as to how she was going to get through this. She knew there would come a time when she would be strong enough to cope, but right now it was all too much, and that possibility seemed out of reach and a lifetime away. Chapter 4. Carl observed the ship absent-mindedly as it pulled up to the dockside for the crew to secure. He felt numb, as he had done since they had lost their beloved baby daughter. He had spent the last 3 months trying to hide his feelings from his wife and daughter. It was exhausting. He knew he needed to be the strong one in the family, and he did not want them to see his grief and anguish. They were both going through enough themselves without him being a burden. On that fateful day when Bessie had gone into labor early, he had been scared to the core of what might happen. At the hospital, he had tried to reassure his wife as best he could, but he could tell from her face that she knew what was happening. There were no words to comfort or reassure her. The nurse who ushered him and Caroline out of the hospital room had been somewhat cold towards them, not giving them any choice to stay with her. The faces of the medical staff had told Carl what he knew to be happening. He was helpless, not even able to be by his beloved wife's side at this terrible time. While standing outside the maternity ward, he and Caroline tried to make idle conversation, talking about the daisy chain they had made together earlier that day, although that felt like a surreal and distant memory now. Carl was desperate to protect his daughter, but could not leave the corridor as he wanted to be as near to his wife as possible, so he had no choice but to subject her to what was going on around them. They had been able to hear the cries and screams of pain from the room since they had left. Each time, Caroline's eyes had widened in fear, and he had tried to give a reassuring smile, unsuccessfully, most likely as he did not feel reassured himself in any way. When the terrible sounds of his wife's pain subsided, they stood frozen to the spot, staring at the door. Time seemed to stand still. Suddenly, a nurse had rushed out of the door with a small bundle in her arms, concern written all over her face as she scurried down the corridor and out of their view, without even so much as a glance in their direction. He had pushed his way through the door, desperate to find out what was happening. Immediately, he regretted doing so, as he knew Caroline would follow, and they were faced with the horror of the aftermath of a difficult birth. It was distressing for him to see, let alone an 8-year-old child, but he simply had to be with his wife. They had huddled together, fearful of the news that they dreaded was to come. Until the news did come, and they knew for sure that their baby daughter and sister had been taken from them too soon. Everything seemed to be a blur from that moment onwards for Carl. It took all his strength to support his family in their time of need, but he felt hollow. He had continued to work, as they needed the money for food and medication to care for Bessie during her recovery. He had hoped work would be an adequate distraction, but he had found it hard to concentrate, was unusually abrupt with his crew, and had no desire to be there. If he was honest, he had no desire to be anywhere. The only solace he had been able to find was in the bottom of a bottle. He felt ashamed that he had started to drink, and he felt as though it could be getting out of hand. He never was and never would be violent after a drink. It simply seemed to numb the pain in his heart. After work, he would have a drink with the men with whom he worked, and then make his way home to the sadness that surrounded them, where he would often fall asleep without eating his evening meal. Carl knew he was letting his family down, but this knowledge just made it worse, compounding the self-loathing and self-blame that was building inside of him. He feared going home directly after work, as he knew he was not able to cope with the emotions, and so would go for a harmless drink, which could lead to 2 or 3 or 4. Each drink would add to the guilt he felt of the time not spent with his family and the money he was wasting, but it was all he could do right now. "Carl!" He heard one of his colleagues shout his name, which brought him out of his thoughts and back to the work at hand. Slap. Chapter 5. Bessie was finding it hard to know how to help her husband. She knew this had been a hard time for them all, but she had faced the grief head-on and felt as though she was more able to cope now. Of course, she was still absolutely devastated at the loss of their baby girl, but she was now more able to focus her time and attention on Caroline as she started to manage the grief. Carl had been very distant towards both of them, particularly over the last few months. He was often home late from work, and she could smell the alcohol on him, so knew he had taken to drinking. Financially, this was a challenge as she struggled to make ends meet each week with the little money they had. She never mentioned this to her husband as she knew this would only exacerbate how he was feeling. That morning when he had left for work, he had seemed even more distant than normal. His mind had been so preoccupied that he hadn't even kissed either of them goodbye, which he always had done when he left the house. The two had rushed down the stairs to wave him off, but he hadn't so much as looked back, so caught up was he in his grief. "Mummy, do you think Lucy would have looked like me?" Bessie was startled by the question, but not surprised as she had been encouraging her daughter to talk about her baby sister. She knew it was not sensible to bottle up feelings and thought this would be the best way for them to help each other, so they often talked about Lucy. "Well, of course I think she would have had your smile, your little dimples in your cheeks, and you two would have laughed together so much." "I do too. I miss my baby sister." Before she had the chance to gather her daughter up in her arms into a loving embrace, the door chimed to alert them of a visitor. Bessie smiled reassuringly at her daughter, but they both knew they were equally hopeful that it was not Grandma and Grandpa visiting again. They had started to pop around more regularly in the afternoons, always around 2 o'clock, and it was always uncomfortable as they would not allow any talk of Lucy, probably for fear of upsetting them. Ironically, though, it upset them more to pretend that she had never existed. "Let me go and see who that is," she said as she left the room and headed down the corridor to the stairs. As Bessie approached the building's door, she felt relieved that it was not her parents who had come to visit, but simultaneously confused as to who it could be and what they might want. "Hello? May I help you?" she asked the two suited gentlemen who stood before her, certain they must have the wrong address. She listened as the taller of the two men told her the very bad news that her husband had earlier that day died on the docks where he worked. Bessie struggled to comprehend what they were telling her, and she only half heard what had become of her beloved Carl. A sudden silence fell across them all, as no one knew what to do or say. The man accompanying the speaker had not yet spoken, but he looked solemn and bereft, his eyes sunk into their sockets. With tears in his eyes, he looked at Bessie and tried to fill the silence. "Ma'am, I tried to catch his attention, but his mind was elsewhere. I called out his name, but it was too late, and the crate that we were unloading from the ship was already on him. It was all so fast, there was nothing I could do. I must go. My daughter." Her voice teetered off as she abruptly left the two men at the door, unsure what to do with themselves. Never before had she needed her parents more, and how she now wished that it had been them at the door rather than the two men who had been bearing such dreadful news. As she made her way back to Caroline, all she could think about was that he had never even kissed them both goodbye that morning. Chapter 6. It had been a difficult Christmas for Bessie and Caroline without Lucy and Carl. Festive seasons really had a way of reminding one of what was lost. But she was determined to make sure they celebrated as best they could. They had always enjoyed the most wonderful Christmases together, and the opportunity to spend so much time together while Carl was not at work, which highlighted the stark contrast of this year. But they had gotten through it. On Christmas morning, she had woken Caroline early with forced excitement in her voice and encouraged her to come downstairs to open her present and revel in the day. Bessie knew this was to be their last Christmas in the home they had lovingly created together. Although she had not yet told her daughter this, her parents knew, and they had made sure to spend the Christmas period with them. The untimely passing of her husband had not only devastated the pair, but had also left them financially broke. Try as she might, she could find no way for them to continue to live there. Her parents had invited her and Caroline to stay with them, but she was reluctant to do this. Although she was eternally grateful for her parents' support since Carl's passing, she had very little desire to live with them on a long-term basis. The last day in their family home would be the last day of the year. Following this, they would stay with her mother and father for a little while until they had planned what to do next. Bessie had never worked, taking the role of housewife and mother, the responsibilities of which she had taken seriously. She had always wanted to be at home, and she and Carl had both been happy with this arrangement. It suited them both. Now, however, this left her with a distinct lack of skills and aptitude for work. She had taken to mending clothes for people, but that didn't bring in much money, and certainly nowhere near enough to pay their way. Nevertheless, she had managed to buy a present for her daughter to open on Christmas morning. Caroline had been delighted with the baby doll she unwrapped that morning. Bessie had been touched when her daughter announced that her baby doll would be called Lucy, after her baby sister. Bessie's heart hurt when she looked at her daughter and thought about how much she had been through this past year. It had been hard enough for her to manage her feelings, let alone an 8-year-old child. With reminders everywhere they went, be it in the community or with the people they saw, it was increasingly difficult for either of them to find any peace. She could not stand to see her daughter continue to pine for what could have been, and moan about the area in which she no longer enjoyed residing. Maybe it was time for the two of them to find a fresh start, maybe to even leave New York, where she had lived her whole life. "I think it's time to get this little one to bed," suggested Moira, her mother, startling Bessie out of her thoughts. "Yes, of course, you're right," she replied as she looked at her daughter, who was rubbing her eyes, lying on the ground, her precious baby doll tucked into her arms. "Come on, Caroline, time for bed." Caroline wearily got to her feet and followed her mother towards her bedroom. While she was preparing her daughter for bedtime with a fairy tale story, the full gravity of what they were going through hit Bessie. Why could they not have had the fairy tale ending that was so common in these stories? Her daughter was sound asleep within a few minutes, exhausted from the last few days, if not the recent months. She suddenly felt the need to sleep too. Her nights had been restless for as long as she could remember, and that was catching up on her. She went to bid goodnight to her parents, who would be spending the night on the pull-out bed in the kitchen. Prasadi. "Bessie, before you go to bed, please come and sit with us for a moment." She did as she was instructed, with no energy to do otherwise. "What is it? Are you both well?" she asked anxiously. If the last year had taught her anything, it was that things could be snatched away at a moment's notice, and she was terrified of losing another loved one. "Nothing to worry about," her father replied, a reassuring but worried look on his aging face. "But we do need to tell you that your mother and I will be going home tomorrow. We have a few things that we need to do in the house before you and Caroline join us." The air was still as Bessie took in this information, and her mother and father waited on her response. Unable to control her emotions any longer, she broke down in tears. Her mother rushed to her side and put her arms around her shoulders in a warm embrace. Now," her mother soothed. "No need to cry about us. We shall be seeing you next week when you come to join us." Bessie tried to nod in agreement, knowing she was being unreasonable to expect her parents to stay with her until the very end of their time there. Saying goodbye to this house was something she and Caroline would have to do alone, no matter how much it might hurt. Chapter 7. Life at her parents' had not been too bad for her and Caroline. In fact, she had quite enjoyed the liberation from her normal homely chores, allowing her mother to carry on as before and to look after them both. But the fact did remain that they were still in New York and still around their familiar surroundings and all the memories associated with them. Bessie knew that Caroline was missing her father terribly, and she also understood how heartbroken she was over the loss of the sister she never even got to know. And so it was that she decided to take a huge leap and lead them both into a new life away from New York. Her parents had not taken to this idea, eager to keep their family close by. But when she explained the grief and the few prospects for their granddaughter in New York, they were at a loss for words, unable to argue against their daughter's logic. One of Bessie's friends had come to visit her at her mother and father's a few months earlier and had been discussing the possibility of becoming a mail-order bride and heading out west to forge a new life. Bessie had not heard of this before and had been intrigued. She knew that she and her daughter needed a fresh new start, but she certainly didn't feel ready to meet a new man and take a new husband. Her friend assured her that there were many men in need of help and support for themselves, and sometimes even their own children whose mothers had passed away. When out collecting the groceries that morning for her mother, Bessie happened upon a copy of the Matrimonial Times, which she purchased, placing it into her bag quickly and discreetly before anyone could see. She felt as though she would be judged, since she had so recently lost her husband. But her priority now was her daughter, and she was in desperate need of change and moving forward. Back in the safety of her parents' house with Caroline playing out on the lawn, she sat on the rickety wooden chair on the porch and perused the advertisements within. She could hear her mother and father talking quietly inside the house and suspected they were again talking about her and Caroline and what would become of them. She knew she was a constant worry to them and wanted that to stop. Immediately, one of the advertisements leaped out at Bessie, and she held her breath as she read. A widower, aged 31 years, with a 5-year-old daughter, Grace, seeks an eligible lady to care for child and home in California. Must be kind, thoughtful, and considerate, and enjoy the company of children. A sister for Caroline, thought Bessie. It was unfortunate that he was in California, as she hated the hot weather and knew it would be too hot for her there, and she also knew how much Caroline loved the snow, which was unlikely there. In truth, she had had her heart set on Colorado, and so she took the time to read through the other advertisements to see if any others stood out for her. No other advert had caught her attention quite like the one she first saw. And so she weighed up the options in her head and decided that Caroline would probably love the idea of a baby sister more than she cared about snow. With that in mind, she decided to write to Eric Westwood, the first advertiser. Dear Eric, I do hope my letter finds you and your daughter well. I saw your advertisements in the Matrimonial Times, and after some careful consideration, I decided to write to you. I too am recently widowed and have a daughter, Caroline, aged 9, who is desperate to have a little sister, and so your words jumped out at me. I am aged 30, and I believe I would be perfect to care for your child and home in California. I notice you were seeking someone kind, thoughtful, and considerate. I believe I hold all of these traits, and I truly do enjoy the company of children. I would love to know more about you and your little Grace. If you feel you would like to correspond with me, with kindest regards, Bessie Cameron. Chapter 8. A week after Bessie had sent the letter to Eric, she was nervously awaiting a response. She had told her friend that she had replied to an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times, but nobody else knew. Her mother and father had started talking about the adaptations they planned to make to their home to allow Caroline and Bessie to stay long-term. She had tried to put them off, insisting she wanted to get her own place, but they would hear nothing of it and wanted to help them as best they could. Bessie, you have mail, called her mother from outside. Her heart fluttered and her stomach took a tiny flip as she anxiously made her way to retrieve the letter from her mother. Thank you, Mother, she said nonchalantly as she took a hold of the letter and turned on her heel to re-enter the house and go to her room to read it in private. Well, who is it from? Moira called behind her, intrigued as to who would be writing to her daughter. Without turning around, Bessie exaggeratedly shrugged her shoulders to plead ignorance as to who it might be. When she reached her room and pushed her door open, she found Caroline playing with her baby doll in the center of the room that they shared. She felt a moment of frustration as she wondered whether she would ever have any time to herself. She caught herself and reminded herself that her daughter was indeed her priority, and so she popped the letter into the top drawer of her nightstand, closed the drawer, and got down on the floor to play with Caroline. Later that evening, when Caroline had drifted off to sleep, Bessie took the opportunity while it was quiet to open her letter. She felt giddy with excitement, for surely it was a letter from Eric, and if he were not interested in her, he would simply not have replied. She gently and quietly unpeeled the seal of the envelope and took out the paper. Dear Bessie, thank you for your letter. Grace and I are very well. Thank you for asking. I hope you don't mind, but I read your letter to Grace and she was very excited to hear that you have a daughter aged 9. She too has always wanted a sister. I'm glad you took the time to respond to my advertisement. I have to admit to having completed the advertisement with some trepidation, and although I had a number of responses, yours is the first to which I've replied. You said in your letter that you would like to know more about me and Grace, and we too would like to know more about you and your Caroline. I'm afraid I'm not frightfully interesting, but I shall try to tell you what I think you might like to know. My wife died very suddenly during childbirth, leaving me to bring up our daughter alone. I was fortunate to have a nanny who was wonderful with Grace. However, she was elderly and passed away a few months ago. I'm finding it difficult to give enough time to Grace and manage my work on the ranch. This is what led me to place the advertisement you saw. A local rancher had done the same a year ago and now has his new wife living with them, and they're very happy. So, I decided to give it a go. I don't want to bore you by talking about myself too much, so I will sign off for now and will look forward to your response. Kindest of regards and best wishes, Eric. For a while, Bessie just stared at the letter that she had just read. She felt excitement building in the pit of her stomach. Their lives seemed to have been quite similar in some respects, but living on a ranch was quite different from what she was used to. She thought of what an adventure that could be for Caroline. With a smile on her face that hadn't been there for a long time, she popped the letter back into her drawer, closed it securely, and returned to spend the evening with her parents. They sat together on the porch, in the warm evening breeze, and chatted comfortably. But the letter from Eric was never far from Bessie's thoughts. She stayed with them for as long as was polite before she proclaimed how tired she was and took herself off to bed for an early night. She doubted she would get much sleep, excited as she was for what could be, but she was willing tomorrow to come so that she could write her letter of response and take the short walk to town with Caroline in tow to drop it off. She was glad her mother had not pried any more into the writer of the letter. She was not yet ready to tell her parents about her correspondence with Eric, but equally did not want to lie to them. As she lay in bed trying desperately to get some sleep and make the morning come more quickly, she realized this was fruitless, pulled back the blankets, and stepped out of the bed. She did not know how long she had been in her bed, but the house was now silent, and she suspected her parents had now gone to bed too. She put on her robe, silently withdrew the letter from her top drawer, and placed it inside the robe that was held in place by the belt. She also collected her writing equipment from the bureau. She then descended the stairs quietly and made her way to the kitchen table. She chose to sit on the chair furthest from her, so she could see the stairs and would be more likely to notice anyone approaching. Dear Eric, I was delighted to receive your correspondence. I enjoyed reading about your life, although I am sorry to hear about your wife. My husband died last year, so I know how difficult it can be, but being left with a child and a ranch must have been particularly challenging. I do hope that over time, once we have got to know each other, I will be able to help unburden the pressures you must be feeling. I certainly did not find your letter to be a bore and enjoyed learning more about you and Grace. I selfishly hope you will not take the time to respond to any of the other ladies who may have answered your advertisement, but of course, I understand if you do. It certainly sounds as though our daughters will get along famously. I have not yet mentioned you to Caroline as I don't want to get her hopes up. She has suffered so much disappointment over the last year, so I do need to protect her. I hope you understand. With kindest wishes, I look forward to your response, Bessie X. Bessie felt like a teenager again as she nervously and excitedly put a kiss on the end of her letter. Before she could change her mind, she folded it in half, collected the envelope from the table, and popped it in, sealing it promptly. She then took both letters back upstairs with her, relieved to hear her daughter's steady sleeping breath as she climbed back into her bed, the letters safely tucked away in her top drawer. Chapter 9. Eric and Bessie had been corresponding with each other for almost 5 months before she received this much-coveted letter from him. Dearest Bessie, I again hope this letter finds you well, and that Caroline is starting to manage her grief and is at least feeling a little better. Bessie, I hope you don't find me too forward in putting this proposition to you, but I believe we are getting on famously. I enjoy reading your letters, and indeed look forward to them arriving. We have been able to share with each other our pasts, and we both believe our daughters' lives would be enriched with a sister to play with and confide in. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of course, I realize this would be a disruption to your life, as you and Caroline would need to travel to California, but I assure you that Grace and I would make you feel very welcome and would make our home yours. As there are no other women living on the ranch with us, it would not be proper for you to stay in the house until we are married. So, as I see it, we have two options. Either we can find somewhere for you to stay until we marry, or I can arrange for our marriage to take place on the day of your arrival so that you can move straight in with us. I would prefer the last option, but will respect your wishes if you are agreeable to become my wife. I have enclosed the means of payment for your travel, should you decide to make me a very happy man. I will await your letter in response, and if you are agreeable, you could let me know when you plan to travel. I have also included a list of the dates and times of train travel from your nearest train station, so that you are able to make a suitable decision for yourself and Caroline. I will await your correspondence hopefully. Warmest wishes, Eric. She struggled to slow her breath as the realization kicked in of what he had asked her. This is just what she and Caroline had been hoping for. She had shared the letters with Caroline a few months earlier, and she was excited at the prospect of having a younger sister. They had discussed living in California, and although they both thought it would be too hot, they agreed they would be able to manage. Bessie had not yet shared any of this information with her parents, fearful that they would not understand that she might marry a man she had never met. The latest letter, however, deemed it impossible to put off any longer, as she had every intention of accepting his proposal and making the journey as soon as they could. She felt there was no time to waste. Caroline was still struggling dreadfully with the constant reminders of her father, and they both thought a fresh start would be the best for them both. Caroline folded the letter and put it back into its envelope and into the top drawer of her wooden night table. She then took a deep breath and made her way down the stairs to speak with her mother, as her father was still away at work. "Good morning, my love." Her mother greeted her as she rose from her chair to pour her daughter a cup of coffee. As they did every morning, they both took their fresh coffees out onto the porch and took their allocated seats next to each other. Bessie looked out across the lawn and spotted Caroline seated beneath a tree, seemingly lost in her own thoughts, hugging her beloved baby doll close. At that moment, she looked so small and alone. A good reminder her daughter would surely benefit from having a sister to play with and spend time with. "Mother, I have something I'd like to talk to you about," she said anxiously, unprepared for her mother's reaction. "What is it, Bessie? Are you well? Is Caroline fine?" she asked cautiously, her eyes darting to her darling granddaughter. "We are both fine. Nothing for you to worry about at all. But I want to tell you something that might surprise you, and I want you to listen to all of it before you say anything." Her mother's brow furrowed in confusion, but she nodded her tight agreement. She gently thanked her mother for their hospitality and explained how their lives had been enriched just at the right time by their kindness and caring. She told her again how beneficial it had been for Caroline to be around her grandparents at this time. "But we cannot stay with you forever, Mother. We need to get our lives back on track. And this is something I have been working on. I realize this might come as a surprise to you, but I have been corresponding with a gentleman from California who has today asked me to become his wife, and I intend on accepting." She paused to take a breath and noticed that her mother was about to interject. With a smile on her face, she put her finger to her lips to remind her to hear her out before giving her opinions and thoughts. I know you will be worried about us, but I trust Eric and believe him to be a good man. He has a thriving ranch in California, where he lives in a modest house with his 6-year-old daughter, whose mother died during childbirth. So you see, this would be an opportunity for Caroline to have the sister she's always wanted, and for Eric and me to start afresh after our individual losses. I do hope you and Father will give me your blessing, but even if not, it is something we are going to do. There was an uncomfortable moment of silence between the two ladies as they looked into each other's eyes. Bessie then gave a small nod of her head to indicate that the silence could be broken, and her mother could say what she wanted. I am not really sure what to say. She took a slow sip of her coffee before placing it back on the floor at her feet. We will miss you, both of you. But if it is what you want, and you have truly thought this through, then we will both be behind you every step of the way. All we want is for you to be happy. Bessie saw the tears fill the corners of her mother's eyes and felt her own tears spring forward too. She felt so fortunate to have this pair as her parents. She wished she had always been able to see how wonderful they were. But what about Caroline? Do you think she will be fine with this? I have already shared a lot of this with Caroline, and she is excited at the prospect of having a sister and a fresh start. She noticed her mother flinch. I only spoke to Caroline first because if she were not in agreement, I would never have needed to have this discussion with you. But I haven't yet told her that Eric has asked me to marry him. I wonder if you could wait until your father's home so we can discuss this with him before you tell Caroline about the proposal, just so that we can both come to terms with you going before her excitement builds. This made perfect sense to Bessie, and she nodded her agreement. Chapter 10. As she awoke, she felt the excitement building in the pit of her stomach. Her father had taken the news well and was as supportive as her mother. The day before had gone very slowly as she waited for her father to return from work. Her mother had uncharacteristically taken a trip into town in the afternoon, and Bessie suspected she had gone to visit her husband at the bank where he worked. The suspicions were confirmed later that day when they returned home together. When Bessie saw the horse and cart approaching the house and was able to identify her mother sitting beside her father, her stomach went into a flutter as she realized that her father would now know her intentions. She had asked Caroline to run upstairs to their bedroom to collect her doll by way of distraction and to get her out of the way for the time being. She had waited at the bottom of the steps to the porch for her father to climb down from the cart and give his reaction. With a face that gave away no emotions, he had stood in front of her and then held out his arms and given her a warm embrace. "If you are happy, my darling daughter, then we are happy," he had said, reiterating her mother's words from earlier that day. "You have our blessing and support, and we will always be here when you need us." The three of them had stood together, holding hands, as they silently wept. She was so grateful that they had been understanding of her new situation. They heard Caroline approaching and quickly agreed that it would best to wait until the morning before they told her the news so that they could all have a lovely evening together, which they did. Bessie heard her daughter moving in her bed as she awoke, and so she gently patted the side of her bed, which was their silent way of indicating that they could have a snuggle before they got up for the day. Her daughter promptly hopped out of her bed and rushed to her mother's, where she was welcomed with open arms. "Good morning, my darling girl," she said, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "I have some special news for you." Caroline turned onto her side to face her mother. "What is it, Mother? Is it Eric?" She noticed her daughter's face light up at the mere mention of that possible new life. "Yes, my love. Eric has asked me to marry him. I have spoken to Grandpa and Grandma, and we have their blessing to go if we want to. But I haven't replied to him yet. I wanted to speak to you first." "Oh, we must, Mummy. It is just what we both need. Please write and say we will. I can't wait to have a little sister at long last." She gave her mother a loving hug and jumped out of bed to collect her baby doll before excitedly skipping down the stairs to see her grandparents. Bessie was relieved that the talk had gone so well and allowed her excitement to build. This was really happening. They were finally starting a new life that would help them move on out from under the weight of the past. Neither would ever forget Carl and Lucy, and they would always treasure all the memories they had. But now was the time to live again. She quickly washed and dressed and then made her way downstairs. Her mother, father, and daughter were all outside on their porch, chatting and laughing. They turned their heads to look at her as she approached, mischievous smiles upon Caroline and her mother's faces. "Well, it's safe to say somebody's excited about your new adventure." Her mother gestured towards her granddaughter with a smile that lit up her face. It dawned on Bessie at that moment that her mother and father had likely avoided speaking about Lucy as a way of dealing with their own grief, which she had never even considered. "Mummy, we have decided that you must write the letter this morning to Eric and Grace, and then we will all go into town together to make sure it is sent off quickly. Grandpa and Grandma say they will visit as soon as they can," Caroline stated, her voice high-pitched with excitement. Bessie laid her arm across her father's shoulder and gave him an affectionate kiss on his forehead. "It looks as though you've got a busy day ahead of you," he said to her with an amused smile. "Gosh, may I have a coffee first?" Her daughter laughed. "Only if you're quick." Her mother got a cup of coffee from the kitchen and brought it out onto the porch where they all sat together and chatted about the exciting times ahead. She was glad it was the weekend and that her father would be home from work today. This meant that the plans they had hatched before she had arrived could be carried out together, as their last little adventure before they parted ways for new beginnings. No sooner had she finished her coffee than Caroline was reminding her that she needed to get her letter written, sealed, addressed, and ready to mail off. She left them all outside and went up to her room to collect the most recent letter from Eric, and then sat on her bed to write what would probably be her last letter to him before she finally met him and Grace. "To my darling Eric, it is with much delight that Caroline and I can confirm that I would love to become your wife. I, too, enjoy our correspondence and would like nothing more than to meet you in person, as I am sure we will all get along very well indeed. Caroline is beyond excited to have a new sister, although we are slightly nervous about the temperatures in California. I am sure, however, that we'll become accustomed in time. We see no point in delaying our plans and intend to be on the next train. This is set to depart from our platform on Wednesday coming. Thank you for giving the two options of how to proceed once we arrive. Let's not waste any more time. We should marry on Saturday afternoon at any time following our arrival. If you could make those arrangements, I would very much appreciate it. My parents have given us their full blessing. Although they won't be attending the wedding, they will certainly visit as soon as is practicable, should you be in agreement. Thank you, Eric, for giving us the opportunity for a new life with you and Grace. We look forward to our journey and meeting you both on Saturday. With love, Bessie and Caroline." She felt butterflies in her tummy as she wrote, "With love," for it was the first time she had signed her correspondence in this way. But surely now was the right time for this kind of affection, since within the week they would be husband and wife. She folded the paper, popped it in the envelope, and addressed it to Eric. Once she had made her way downstairs to her family, they were almost ready to leave and hurried her along so that they could get to town. Her mother also reminded her to bring along the money Eric had sent so that she could purchase the train tickets for her and Caroline in advance. Chapter 11. Caroline had finally got used to the movement of the train and no longer struggled with an upset constitution. She happily gazed out the window, watching the scenery go by. As they sat together in their small carriage, although their excitement grew, weariness was becoming too much for the pair. They had now been on the train for 22 hours, without any chance of sleep as yet. It had been upsetting to leave her parents, although they knew they would see them again soon enough. Bessie had promised to write to them as soon as they had settled in their new home so that they could make the necessary arrangements for a visit. She noticed her daughter's eyelids begin to droop as sleep beckoned. "Let's get you more comfortable so that you can have a nap." "I'm not tired." She opened her eyes dramatically wide as if to prove the point. "Of course you are, darling, and it's fine to be tired. We've had a long day so far, and you haven't been able to get any sleep yet. So let's get you comfy and give it a try. You won't miss much, and we can't stay awake for the entire journey, or we will fall asleep as soon as we arrive with Eric and Grace. Whatever would they think of that?" They laughed at the thought of this. Bessie helped Caroline to get more comfortable in her seat with her head on the armrest and feet out on the seat next to her, which was vacant. They had been lucky enough to have the whole carriage to themselves so far on their journey. She placed a blanket over her daughter and gave her a kiss on the cheek as she noticed her eyes were already closed. As her daughter slept, she allowed herself the time to think about Carl and the baby girl they never had the pleasure of meeting. It was unsurprising that her mind would go to Carl on this journey, as she remembered their first meeting on the railway line on which he had worked. The grief was still too much to bear, and she thought it always would be, but at least a fresh start would give her something else to focus on. She thought about how in love she and her husband had been, and how lucky they had been to have so much in common. She hoped this was going to be the case with Eric too. But she was not naive, and she knew that many marriages were not as happy as the one she had enjoyed. Although excited for this new adventure, she was also nervous and held a slight trepidation of what the future might bring. She prayed they would get along as well in person as they had in their letters. Every so often, she was plagued with doubts and allowed herself to think of the possibility that Eric had not received her letter and therefore did not know she had accepted his proposal and that they were on their way. She dreaded arriving on the platform in California to be left uncollected and with no way of finding him or contacting him. She tried to push these thoughts out of her mind. He had received every other letter without a problem. Surely this one would be no different. She felt her own eyes start to become heavy and decided to take a nap while her daughter slept. She made herself as comfortable as could be in the small area and allowed the rocking of the carriage to help her to drift off to sleep. "Mummy, Mummy," she awoke to the calls of her daughter, sounding slightly frantic and panicky. She pulled herself up into a sitting position quickly. "What is it? Are you hurt?" she asked Caroline as she looked across to where she had been. Seeing that she was not there, she looked about and was relieved to see Caroline standing directly in front of her, with two people behind her. "They said they are to sit with us," she exclaimed, clearly distressed at the thought. Bessie smiled reassuringly at Caroline and reminded her that this was not their train and that they expected they might have to share at some time. "Sorry to startle you, ma'am. We have just boarded and was directed this way." The young woman looked nervous as she tried to explain their presence. "All is well. We thought we would have company at some point on our long journey." She gave her a welcoming smile and then asked Caroline to move her things across, as did she to clear space for their new guests. "My name is Janine, and this is my son Jack," the newcomers announced as they shook hands in greeting and made themselves comfortable in their seats. Bessie introduced herself, and her daughter chatted amicably with the little boy. It certainly helped to make the journey pass a little quicker as the two women settled into conversation while the two children played together. Jack was only 2 years old, and she was pleased to see the gentle way in which her daughter treated him, and with such kindness. They soon discovered that they were traveling to California too, and would therefore have their company for the rest of the journey. As they chatted, they exchanged stories, finding their situations remarkably similar. Janine's husband had sadly died when fighting in the American Civil War only a year earlier. He had barely had any time with his baby boy. They had then struggled to manage alone, and she had happened upon the matrimonial times and began corresponding with men in search of mail-order brides. In contrast to her own experience, Janine had written to many men before finding the one she was now traveling to meet and marry. Many of the other men with whom she had corresponded had not been willing to take on her baby boy. She had been so relieved when she started writing to Christopher. He had been fine with her having a son from the outset, and they both wanted to have more children and to start a family of their own. Janine had unfortunately not been blessed with as happy a marriage as she had. She had quietly told Bessie how her husband had been angry most of the time and how he had vehemently taken that anger out on her. She was relieved that their son was too young to have been negatively impacted. She shared in confidence how she had been pleased that he had chosen to fight in the Civil War, simply because it gave them some time apart. She had missed him while he was away and had been looking forward to his return, hopeful for a better future together. When she had received the news of his passing, she had been filled with guilt, having never really considered the dangers he would have been facing. It surprised Bessie that there were more women in similar situations to hers who needed to seek out a new husband in this way, but she was thankful that it had been an option for her and grateful that her friend had mentioned it. Over the next few days of travel, they ate together, slept in each other's company, and chatted with ease. They were all glad they had the opportunity to share the carriage, rather than to have been cooped up with less agreeable company, which would have made for a lengthier journey. They agreed they would try to stay in touch once they had set about with their new lives out west. They exchanged the addresses of the men with whom they would be living as husband and wife. They promised to write once they had all settled in. Janine and Bessie shared their anxieties over what they were doing, but also helped each other to see the positives and become even more excited for their futures. They both chatted about what they might be going to. They both had an idea from the descriptions their husbands-to-be had given, but until they saw their new homes, they could not really anticipate what they would be like. They knew they were both going to ranches, which was new to both of them, as neither had any experience of ranching. They didn't yet know if they even liked horses. But they knew they would do what was needed to enable them to settle in and enjoy a new life, for the sake of their children. The two children had been inseparable throughout the journey. Bessie was relieved to see this, as it proved that Caroline got along well with other children and that she was able to adapt and look after the younger ones. She had only really ever seen her daughter playing with her doll, that being that she hadn't had the opportunity to be around many children before now. The conductor informed them that they were nearing their destination, and they all found themselves somewhat saddened to be parting ways, but reminded each other to stay in touch. They embraced before gathering their belongings and following the small throng of passengers from neighboring coaches to the doors where they waited for the train to come to a full stop before alighting. Bessie's eyes darted around the many people on the platform, eager for the first glimpse of her prince and her happily ever after. Chapter 12. Come on, Grace, or we will be late, Eric called to his daughter, who had been upstairs all morning preparing to leave. He knew she was nervous about meeting what was to be their new family. Coming, Daddy, she had replied as she quickly rushed down the stairs and out to the cart, where he stood patiently waiting. He smiled as he saw her approach. She was an independent little 6-year-old and did not like other people to make a fuss of her. So it was that when they had awoken that morning, she had explained that she would get herself ready and that he should not interfere. She had then helped him to choose what he should wear and sat him on his bed whilst she brushed his hair and made him more presentable. She had then disappeared to her own room for the last few hours. Looking at her now, though, he was unsure what she had been doing with that time. She had chosen to wear one of her very few dresses for the occasion, a simple one in brown. He could tell she had spent time working her hair, but her massive brown curls remained unruly and defiant atop her head. He blamed himself that she was not a girly girl. After all, she had never really been in the company of women. But he loved her just the way she was, and she loved the ranch just as much as he did. They rode horseback together, played games together, and worked the ranch together. They were rarely apart since her birth. As they got in their cart and began their journey to town, Eric wondered what Caroline would be like and hoped that the two girls would get along as well as they hoped. He knew they might not have much in common, having been brought up in very different circumstances, but remained hopeful that this would not stand in the way. Grace was unusually quiet during the ride to the train station. He did not pressure his daughter to talk and appreciated that she might just want time to think or to gather her thoughts. He was grateful for the quiet time to manage his own thoughts. Although he was excited and confident that he had made the right decision, he was also nervous and hoped that Bessie and Caroline would like the life that he had to offer. He pulled the horse up close to the platform and secured it to the hitching post outside the bank, and then helped his daughter down from the cart. He smiled reassuringly and squeezed her hand gently, giving a little wink of his eye, which made her laugh. They made their way to the platform alongside the railway track and waited among the many people who were also there that day to meet passengers as they arrived, or to take the train on to their destinations. Although Bessie had described herself, Eric was worried that he might not recognize her straight away. He was on high alert to look in the windows of the passing carriages as the train slowed, hoping to catch a glimpse of her before she saw him. As they each had a daughter in tow, he knew it would be easier for them to identify each other. Grace held his hand tightly as they waited, and neither spoke. He felt her hand twitch when the conductor shouted from the platform, announcing that the train was approaching. He smiled down at his daughter. "It's all going to be fine, my love. You'll see. We will all get along famously, and you will finally have the sister you have always wanted." To his relief, she smiled in response, and he could see the excitement hidden beneath. He watched as the train slowed before them, and his eyes searched beyond the doors, hopeful for a glimpse of his bride-to-be. And suddenly, there she was. Chapter 13. Bessie need not have worried about recognizing Eric. She caught a glimpse of him as the carriage passed him by. They had made eye contact, and she had felt an unexpected shiver down her spine. He looked taller than she imagined him to be, and of course, he was rather strapping, as you'd expect from a rancher. But most of all, she noticed his handsome, smiling face. They had tried to keep their eyes locked, but the people milling around them prevented that from happening as the train continued along the platform. "Did you see him, Mummy?" Caroline asked, with worry in her eyes. "I did, I think. Don't worry, we will find them and then make our way back to their house." "Our home," she corrected herself, hoping she sounded as confident as she was trying, to alleviate her daughter's worries. They had come to a stop, and slowly the passengers began to open the doors and alight. There was somewhat of a commotion as the passengers disembarked and were met by loved ones. She turned towards Janine, and they bid their final farewells before she hopped off the train with Jack in her arms, waving enthusiastically to Caroline. "Bessie, I presume?" came the deep voice from the platform. She looked in the direction of the sound, only to find the handsome man she had hoped was Eric. She felt her cheeks redden as she realized how attracted she was to him. She hoped he was not disappointed with her. His big grin certainly did not indicate that in any way. Janine had told her stories on the train about women who had gone to meet their husbands-to-be as mail-order brides, only to find they were nothing at all as they had described. They had laughed good-naturedly about this, but it had knotted her stomach with anxiety all the same. She was therefore very relieved that he was at least in the same age bracket as he had led her to believe. He held out his hand as she nodded her head and accepted his help to step down onto the platform. He made sure she was balanced and steady on the floor before turning to her daughter. "And this little beauty must be Miss Caroline?" he asked, as he again held out his hand in a gentlemanly fashion. Bessie felt amused as she watched her daughter nod and accept his hand to hop down from the train. "Very nice to meet you," Caroline said politely, and almost gave a curtsy, which amused Bessie no end. "Did you have a good journey?" he inquired of both of them. "We had quite the adventure, Eric. Thank you," Bessie replied with a radiant smile on her face. "Please let me introduce you to Grace." He turned in the direction of his daughter, who hid shyly behind his legs. "Come out and say hello, silly." "All is fine. We all feel shy sometimes. I am sure we will get to know each other in time," she said to him, and then directed towards his daughter. "Hello, Grace. I am very much looking forward to getting to know you, and so is Caroline." Eric led the way, and they all followed his lead, Grace closely behind, with Bessie holding his arm and Caroline holding her hand. The two girls had not said a word to each other yet, and in fact barely even looked at each other, but she knew it would take time for them to get to know each other. They were clearly both very different from one another, her daughter being very girly and his daughter appearing not to be. As Eric helped them all into the cart, she felt a pang of guilt as she again thought of her dearly departed husband. She snapped herself out of it quickly, eager to concentrate on her new life and not wanting to make life uncomfortable or awkward at all. "I hope it's fine that we're going straight to the church before we go home?" he asked her tentatively. You mouthed that in percent. "I know you said in your letter that there was no point in waiting, which I wholly agree with, so we are to meet with the pastor in half an hour." Bessie looked down at herself and felt self-conscious about what she was wearing. After traveling for 5 days, she did not feel at her best, although she had freshened up, of course, before they had arrived. As if reading her mind, he interjected her thoughts. "Don't worry, the church is just 5 minutes away, so you and Caroline will have plenty of time to use the facilities to get yourselves ready if you would like to." He then looked a little flushed and followed quickly with, "Not that you need to. You look perfectly lovely as you are, but if you want to, you will certainly have the opportunity. I think we would very much like to. Thank you for thinking of us and being so considerate. We have both brought a change of clothes for the ceremony, so it would be nice to have time to get ourselves prepared." They continued the rest of their journey in relative silence, Bessie deep in thought about all she wanted to do before their ceremony, to make her look as best as could be. She did not want her husband-to-be to have any regrets or doubts. As the horse and cart pulled into the church grounds, she caught her breath. The white church in front of them was small but magnificent, unlike anything she had seen in New York. She and Caroline looked at each other, their eyes wide, her daughter's mouth agape as they came to a stop. Again, he helped them down and made sure they were steady on their feet before he stepped back and directed them towards the facilities were. He pointed out where he and Grace would be waiting so that they knew where to go when they were ready. He asked Bessie whether she needed anything from their luggage, and she asked for the carpet bag in which she had placed all they would need for their preparation. She very much appreciated how considerate and thoughtful he appeared to be. Alone in the changing rooms next to the beautiful church, mother and daughter were able to talk privately. "How are you feeling, my darling?" she asked her daughter as she knelt to look her in the eyes. "Are you excited?" "I am." She could sense her daughter was holding back, and so she encouraged her to keep going with a nod of her head. "It's just, I don't think Grace likes me." Her eyes filled with tears before her mother reassured her it would just take everyone a little time to get to know one another and to love each other in the way that families do. Bessie gave as much reassurance as she could, hopeful that Caroline felt a little better afterward, even though she was having reservations of her own. Of course, this was not going to be as easy as she had hoped, so she would have to take her own advice and be patient. They set about getting ready, which didn't take too long. After a quick change of clothes, a light application of makeup for Bessie, and whatever measures were required to manage their slightly bedraggled hairstyles after their long journey, they were both ready to go. When they were quite ready, they made their way to the front of the church, where they were to be met by Eric, Grace, and the two friends who were to be witnesses. Eric stood as he saw them approaching, and she thought she saw a happy expression cross his face, although she could tell he was worried, possibly because Grace was being extraordinarily quiet. "You two look beautiful," he exclaimed, not taking his eyes off Bessie for a moment. She smiled shyly at him, and then she pointedly looked in the direction of his two friends. This seemed to click him into action as he made the introductions. Sorry. Yes, Bessie and Caroline, meet Adam and Laura. Prosody Rathen. They are my very good friends, soon to be yours too, I'm sure, and they are going to witness the joining of us as husband and wife today. They all politely shook hands and then made their way through to the church. The ceremony was short but perfect, achieving all that was required. Within 30 minutes, they were back outside the church and saying their goodbyes to Eric's friends, whose names had escaped her because of her nerves. She looked down at her daughter and was relieved to see a beautiful smile spread across her face. They were going to be just fine. They climbed back into the cart, and Eric took them on the short journey to his ranch. Grace barely said 2 words, whispering into her father's ear if she wanted to say anything. Bessie hoped the child was just shy or nervous, rather than rude and ignorant. At every opportunity, she smiled at her new daughter to let her know that all would be well and that she would look after her. She and Caroline watched the scenery as the cart rolled along the road. The sights were now quite different to what they had been used to in New York. There was beauty everywhere, as far as the eye could see. They were both lost in the wonder of it. Eric steered the horse and cart, with Grace closely behind him, while Bessie and her daughter chatted about all that they could see. They were both quite overawed by the heat of the midday sun, but Eric had bought them both fans, which came in very useful to keep themselves cool. They whispered to each other about how ladylike they must look in the back of the cart, in their finery, with their fans in their hands. "Here we are," announced Eric as he steered the horse off the road and onto the track. Caroline and Bessie looked ahead, looked at each other, and then back to the buildings and grounds before them. The glistening white ranch house ahead of them seemed truly majestic in comparison to the modest tenement which had been their home for so long. The grounds were vast, with cattle grazing in fields as far as the eye could see. Smaller buildings were dotted about the homestead, and Bessie assumed one of these to be Eric's. This assumption was soon dismissed as her now husband led them all into the magnificent stark white home and introduced it as their home. She was quite taken aback and had not expected such opulence from the descriptions in his letters. Eric showed her and Caroline to the room that they would share, discreetly explained that there was no pressure on Bessie to share his bed until she felt ready. They had, after all, just met. Bessie was grateful that he left them alone in their new rooms to get settled, unpack, and take a breath. She and Caroline chatted as they unpacked their belongings. When they had finished, they lay on one of the beds together. Chapter 14. The evening before had been quite strained and the conversation relatively forced. Eric put this down to his new wife and daughter being tired after their long journey. And it wasn't helped by the fact that Grace was refusing to speak to either of them. He knew this was because she was feeling shy, and he hoped that Bessie had realized as much. The pair had tried to encourage the girls to talk to each other over their evening meal, but other than a few mumbled words, it had been fruitless. He had, however, noticed the two glancing at each other when the other wasn't aware, and so he knew that they were indeed showing an interest in each other. After the children had retired to bed that evening, he and Bessie sat together on the porch in the warm evening breeze. They talked about how their girls had not quite clicked as yet, and they both agreed that it was all just a matter of time. They also commented on how different the girls were from one another, and that finding common ground would most certainly help them to bond. He was relieved that he could speak with Bessie so openly, and that their views seemed to be aligned. She had decided to have an early night, understandably so after her long journey. He was unsure how to behave, whether to give her a kiss on the cheek or simply bid her good night at a distance. He had opted for the latter, and as he watched her return inside the house, he immediately regretted it. He had sat on the porch for a good few hours after everybody had gone to bed, deep in thought about his first wife, Grace's mother, and about the future that possibly lay ahead for them. He had found the day rather exhausting, unusual as it was for all of them. But tomorrow was a new day, and he was determined that together they would help the girls to get along and live harmoniously. The following morning, he had taken Bessie and Caroline on a tour of the ranch, showing them around and also introducing them to the ranch hands and the help. He was pleased with his new wife's response to everyone she met and felt reassured that she was going to fit right in. Caroline and Grace tagged along behind, seemingly begrudgingly, neither making a sound. As he now went about his work, he watched his daughter on her horse as she steadied the cattle and helped him to round them up. He could see his new wife and daughter watching them from the porch of the big white house, and he hoped this wasn't too daunting for them. He was well aware that this was a brand new way of life for them, and he was not going to pressure them in any way. Should they want to help at any time, he was happy to teach them. But likewise, if they did not want to, he would be satisfied with their decision. Bessie seemed keen to look after the house full time. She had explained the night before that she liked to keep herself busy. He had told her that there was no pressure on her and that she was free to do whatever she wanted. He had explained that he was not concerned about the interior of the house and that should she want to make any additions or changes, she was more than welcome to do so. He wanted her and Caroline to feel as welcome as possible in their new home. He waved up at the house in the direction of Bessie, although they were quite far away. He thought he saw her waving back, which sent a little flutter through his stomach. When he had first set eyes on her, he had been pleasantly surprised by her appearance. She had definitely played herself down when she had described herself, and he found her to be enchanting. He had not expected her to be fetching to the eye and had simply hoped that they would get along conversationally, not even considering that there would be an attraction with someone he had never met before. Prosody. "Grace, let's stop and sit for a while," he called to his daughter once the cattle were herded and at ease. This was not uncommon, as they liked to sit and watch the cattle for a little while every so often. It was nice to take a break when they could. They both pulled up their horses and dismounted, leaving them to graze while they took their usual positions on the mound overseeing the field of cattle. They had many calves at the moment, following a successful spring, which made watching the herd all the more pleasant. "How are you doing, kid?" he asked his daughter. "Weird times, huh?" She nodded her head in agreement, still seemingly reluctant to speak. "It will get easier, you will see. They both seem great, though, don't they?" He gently coaxed Grace into conversation, knowing she would not be able to help but voice her opinions. He was proud that he was bringing her up to be an independent woman who would not be afraid to speak her mind. "I like Bessie," she stated, silently impressing upon the fact that she was not too sure about her new sister just yet. "She's pretty." "She sure is," he agreed, rather too enthusiastically, he thought. "When you get to know her better, I'm sure you will be able to call her Mom, if that's what you'd like. Let me know if you would like me to chat to her about that, or if you'd rather do that yourself when you feel the time is right." They sat together and chatted some more, and he encouraged his daughter to make more of an effort to get along with her new sister, reminding her that they had left their home to journey to a strange new place to be with them. He explained that this could be quite an upheaval for them, and that it would be helpful if they could work together to settle them in. Chapter 15. They had been in California for a few weeks now. Bessie had definitely hoped it would be easier for them to settle in than it had been so far. She felt relatively good about the relocation and was getting used to the new lifestyle. But she worried about Caroline, the once very girly girl who was now hiding her doll in her room as if she was embarrassed by it. She would catch her daughter watching Grace riding the horses and working the ranch, and she wondered how she must be feeling. "You don't seem to play with your doll much anymore," she stated, more as a question. Caroline shrugged her shoulders, trying to dismiss the point. "Have you outgrown her?" "I thought you would love your baby doll, Lucy, forever. It is okay to play with dolls, even if others don't. It's just..." "Go on, my love, you can tell me anything." "I know we are in a confusing time at the moment. It will help us both to talk it through. It seems babyish to play with my doll now. I am much older than Grace, and she doesn't seem to have any dolls." Her daughter's face grew pink with embarrassment, which tugged at her heartstrings. "I don't think you should compare yourself to Grace. You have both had very different upbringings. Maybe she has been too busy on the range with her father to have the opportunity to play as you have. She might not know the joy of playing with a baby doll." Caroline looked up into her blue eyes, a look of bewilderment on her face. "You mean Grace might like to play with dolls if I show her how?" "I think it might be worth a try. What do you think?" she coaxed her daughter, wanting her to make the final decision that could help the two girls to bond. She took a moment to think this through. Bessie allowed her the time and did not interrupt. She then got up from the kitchen table and abruptly left the room, leaving her mother somewhat confused. She got up off her own chair and began washing the breakfast dishes and tidying the kitchen. Eric and Grace had already gone out onto the range, and she would begin the preparations for lunch. As she finished doing the dishes, she heard Caroline's dainty footsteps on the stairs above her and turned towards the door, anticipating her presence in the room. She smiled as her daughter came into the kitchen, cradling her baby doll proudly. "Ah, what do we have here? The return of Lucy," she commented, pleased that their conversation had had such a quick impact. "I thought I would introduce Grace to Lucy this afternoon when they have finished on the ranch. What do you think?" she asked with a note of anxiety in her voice, still needing a little reassurance from her mother. "I think that would be a wonderful idea. We could even set up a little picnic area under the tree for you both, so that you could eat your lunch with Lucy and play," she suggested to her daughter, who was now wide-eyed and smiling. "There is something else." Caroline hesitated as she shifted awkwardly from one foot to the other. Bessie beckoned for her to continue. "I think I will also ask Grace to introduce me to her favorite horse." She looked into her mother's eyes, keen to know her views on this suggestion. "Caroline, what a perfect thing to do. I think if you two girls can find out more about what you're both interested in, you will see you have more in common than you think, and then you will become friends. I am so proud of you." Her daughter's face glowed with pride. The pair busied themselves for the rest of the morning, preparing for the afternoon's delights in the warm midday sun. There was a new excitement in the air, which filled Bessie with a renewed hope for the future. She had been growing more and more concerned, but after having this conversation, things could only get better. Together, they prepared the shaded area under the large oak tree, outside the front of the house. They laid a rug out on the grass and placed Lucy the doll right in front of the tree, with places set either side for Caroline and Grace. More than once, Bessie found herself looking out across the land, searching for her husband. When she caught a glimpse of him, her stomach did a flip, and she gazed at him wistfully. Each time was followed with a pang of guilt, as though she was doing something wrong or being unfaithful to her departed husband. She knew that was illogical and tried to push those thoughts to the back of her mind. They all needed to concentrate on their new life together. She marveled at how proud she was of her daughter. She understood how fearful she was of the horses. They had, of course, been in carts being pulled by horses before, but they had never been on horseback or in any contact directly with the horses. They seemed so big and formidable to her, let alone how they must look to a child. But she knew that she was willing to try to overcome that for the sake of her new sister. Over the last few weeks, although Grace and Caroline had been reluctant to communicate much, Bessie had been building quite a lovely relationship with her new stepdaughter. It had taken only a few days before the pair had started doing things together. They both enjoyed being in the kitchen, and so they baked together, making cakes, cookies, and other delights, which she and Caroline were now laying out on their picnic blanket. With everything prepared and laid out, they sat on the picnic blanket together and looked out across the meadow, patiently awaiting the return of the hungry workers. Chapter 16. He could not help but smile as he approached the picnic area underneath the tree in front of the house. His new wife and child had clearly been hard at work preparing their lunch, although he noticed quite quickly that there were only settings for two on the blanket. He glanced around and spotted another picnic area set up on the porch, presumably for the two adults, which pleased him. He looked down at Grace, who looked anxious and bemused as she was figuring out what appeared to be going on too. "What a lovely thing for them to have done," he exclaimed to her, hoping to make her see the positives and to not withdraw. She had been in a particularly jovial mood all morning, and they had had a wonderful time out on the range together. Her eyes glowed, showing a glimmer of excitement. "And just in time, I am starving, and I bet you are too," he asked. "Actually, I am," she replied, giving him hope that she was going to be amenable to the efforts that had been made for her. Bessie rose to her feet as they neared the picnic area. She winked inconspicuously in Eric's direction, which he noticed gave him a funny feeling in the pit of his stomach. He supposed she was trying to tell him what was going on and for him to go along with it. Without questioning the situation, she prompted Grace to take her place on the picnic blanket, and she moved a large picnic basket closer to the pair so that they knew they could help themselves. She then promptly guided him onto the porch. There they sat, the two newlyweds, enjoying their picnic lunch, while casually and rather nervously observing their two daughters on the grass before them. "Well, I don't know what you did to make this happen," he smiled at his wife, thankful for her part in this new development. It still felt odd to think of himself as having a wife again after all this time. It was mostly Caroline's idea after a chat we had this morning, to be honest. It seems to be going well. Maybe this is the beginning of the budding relationship that we had hoped for the two girls. He felt their eyes meet and could not pull his away. She was so captivating. Not only was she beautiful, but her kindness and beauty shone from within. He really could not believe his good fortune. After what seemed like an eternity, she broke eye contact and looked down bashfully. Eric was pleased that they had decided to take their time in their relationship. Although they were already married, he was not pressuring Bessie in any way, as he wanted matters to progress naturally. At first, he had wondered if this would happen, fearful that his new wife might not be interested in him in any romantic way. But he now thought there was a spark between them, one that was not one-sided. "Eric, look," she remarked, her voice pitched higher than normal with excitement. He looked in the direction that she was looking in, and they together watched their daughters play with the doll which Caroline had brought with them. He had never seen Grace play with a doll, or in fact with anything girly. The nanny that they had been blessed with for the first few years of Grace's life was not a fan of toys and preferred rather to teach as soon as his daughter was old enough to learn. He had never been sure if this was the right thing to do, but with such a lack of knowledge of how to raise children, he had felt he had no option but to go along with it. Watching his daughter now engrossed in play with her new sister caused him a pang of guilt. Maybe he should have allowed this earlier. Maybe he should have given her more time to play and less time on the ranch with him. As if reading his mind, Bessie interjected his thoughts. "You know, the girls have had such a different upbringing, but that doesn't mean they can't get along." Caroline had spent no time with horses or on a ranch, and I believe she is going to ask Grace to help her with this too. She is ever so scared of the horses. I fear I have mollycoddled her too much. I was just thinking similarly, that I should have been allowing Grace to play more. He felt sad that he might have done anything that might be to the detriment of his daughter's upbringing. He and his previous wife had never really talked about what life would be like when the baby arrived. They had just taken it for granted that she would take the lead role and would know what to do through instinct. So, when she died during the terrible childbirth, he had been thrown into parenthood head first, along with having to deal with the grief of losing his beloved wife. It felt good for them to sit and talk about their children, and it gave him hope for the future he had always wanted for himself and his daughter. "Shall we go and join them?" she suggested, as she piled their plates and cups onto the small table next to her wooden chair. He had been so engrossed in their conversation that he had not realized how much he had already eaten. He had been more famished than he realized after a day of hard work in the heat on the ranch. He nodded his agreement, and together they rose and wandered across the porch and out onto the meadow. "May we join you?" he asked the pair, who were engrossed in their play with the doll. They were startled by his voice, so preoccupied had they been. This filled him with delight. They nodded their agreement for them to join them, and Eric and Bessie sunk down onto the picnic blanket. They all sat together amicably. They talked, they laughed, they enjoyed each other's company. The time flew by, and before they knew it, the afternoon had passed. The atmosphere seemed to have changed between them as a new settled feeling came upon them all. "Grace, I believe Caroline has something she would like to ask you." He noticed Caroline frown up at her mother's words, clearly embarrassed by the prompt that she must have felt was unnecessary. But she quickly dismissed this and shared a huge smile with them all. "Yes, I do," she agreed as she looked at her sister. "I wondered if tomorrow you could maybe introduce me to your favorite horse and help me to get used to being around them. I know it probably seems silly to you, but they really do scare me. They are so big." Grace nodded her head enthusiastically. She let out a little giggle. "Oh, Caroline, horses are not scary at all. You just need to know what to do with them. You'll see, you will soon love them. I can't wait to introduce you to Shadow. And if you would like," he interrupted their conversation, "I could give you some lessons to help you get used to riding." They both nodded eagerly, smiling at each other in excitement. "And then we can go out riding on the ranch together," his daughter declared. He felt so proud of how she had handled this turn of events. When they had approached earlier that day, he had been concerned that she would retreat into herself again and that she would be reluctant to join in. But she'd had a lovely afternoon with her new sister, and he thought that was all thanks to his beautiful wife, who had dealt with the whole situation perfectly, in his opinion. "This all sounds perfect, and I am sorry to be a party pooper. I am sure it's time for you to get back out onto the ranch and finish up for the day." He knew she was right, and he nodded his agreement, but he was reluctant to move just yet. Reluctant for this perfect, long-awaited moment to pass. Chapter 17. Bessie watched as her daughter's frustration grew. Eric was so patient, so kind and caring, and so thoughtful of her feelings. Each time she grew worried, he would reassure her with words and smiles. She watched on helplessly, for she knew nothing about horses and wasn't quite as brave as Caroline. She would learn to ride at some point, but for now she was happy on her own 2 feet. "Try not to worry," Grace called up to her sister as she sat astride a huge horse. "Daddy says they can feel anxiety. Sometimes when I get scared, I just smile anyway and pretend I'm fine so the horse doesn't know." "You get scared?" asked Caroline incredulously, as if this were unfathomable. "Yes, of course. Sometimes Shadow goes too fast and I get a bit nervous. That's okay, but just try not to show it." Together they kept going, as they had done every day for just over 2 weeks. Of course, she was making some improvements, albeit small ones, but most importantly, the 3 of them had something in common that they wanted to combat. Bessie loved nothing more than to watch them working together to overcome that challenge. Seeing how kind, thoughtful, and considerate Eric was with the children proved to her that he was the perfect father. She had suspected this from their correspondence before they even met. From what he had said, she had been attracted to his fatherly nature. Now she could see that firsthand, and it filled her with a warm feeling. They had got into a comfortable routine. Eric and Grace worked the ranch in the mornings, returned for their lunch prepared by Caroline and Bessie, an hour's horse riding lesson before Eric went alone back to the ranch to finish off his work. She then used this time to prepare their evening meal, as she watched from the kitchen window as the girls played with the baby doll, Lucy. The sound of the laughter echoed around the grounds and filled her heart with joy. The ranch hands all loved the girls and enjoyed watching them during their lessons when they had a spare moment. They gave plenty of encouragement and cheered when Caroline achieved a milestone. With the lesson drawing to an end, the girls walked together to the barn to pet Grace's horse, Shadow, as they often did. Grace had had Shadow for just over 3 years, and she loved him so. She was reluctant to let anybody else ride him, but she proudly showed him off to Caroline and helped her to get used to being around horses. Shadow was a large horse with a very placid nature, and he loved being stroked and cuddled. Eric returned to the porch to have a coffee with her before he went back to work. "She is making good progress," he reassured a doubtful-looking Bessie. He laughed. "No, really, Caroline is coming on in leaps and bounds. She just doesn't realize it herself. But she is now holding the reins properly, sitting comfortably, thinking about what she does, and treating the horse with respect rather than fear. I think she is going to be a good rider, actually. It looks like we're going to need a new horse." "Oh, Eric, you can't buy her a horse," she declared, reluctant to accept such a generous gift. He had given them both so much already. "Nonsense. Any daughter of mine needs to have a horse of her own. And anyway, we also need to buy Grace a doll, by the look of things." They both laughed happily at the turnaround of events over these last few weeks. Her heart fluttered and threatened to burst as she heard him refer to Caroline as his daughter. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hooves, and their attention moved to the entrance of the barn that the girls had gone into together. They were both quite dismayed to see Caroline astride Grace's horse, Shadow. Ying. The younger of the two was leading the way, guiding Shadow to where she wanted him to go, whilst her sister happily rode behind. Bessie and Eric looked from them to each other and then back to their daughters in disbelief. It seemed they had cracked it together. Both girls looked delighted and oblivious to their onlookers. "Will they be okay?" asked Bessie cautiously, concerned that her daughter might fall from such a height without an adult supervising. "They will be absolutely fine," he assured her confidently, eradicating all her worries. "Shadow is a lovely horse. I'm so pleased Grace has allowed her to ride him, and she is more than competent. Please do not worry. This is what we wanted after all." She knew he was right. This was everything they had been hoping for, the two girls together enjoying their play. "Mom, Dad, can we go to the meadow?" called Grace, seeking permission to venture further afield than normal. He looked at her before giving the go-ahead, and together they agreed with a slight nod of the head that this would be fine. Bessie's heart swelled at the sound of Grace calling her mom for this first time, and she knew it had not gone unnoticed by Eric as he beamed a huge smile at her before he turned to face their girls. "Yes, go ahead, but please be careful and take your time, but don't be too long." The girls looked at each other and let out a little squeal of delight, and off they went to explore together. Friends at last. Sisters forever. Bessie looked at Eric, a contented smile on her face, happy and encouraged with how things had turned out. He returned her gaze. Finally, they kissed, and Bessie knew at that moment that this was where she belonged. Epilogue. A year on from the day they had married in the majestic white church, Bessie sat on the picnic blanket under the large oak tree and leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. She had never felt more settled and satisfied with her life. She still remembered Carl with fond memories and still thought of the baby girl they had lost. But now the sadness had been overtaken by the happiness she and Caroline had been blessed with. Eric had created a small memorial area in their garden in memory of Lucy. When he had shown it to her, she had cried and could not believe how thoughtful and kind he was. She and her daughter spent a lot of time there together. Eric kissed her forehead gently, his long legs intertwined with hers. "Just look at them," he urged her. She sat upright, just as their daughters were emerging from the barn, each of them on horseback, Grace on Shadow and Caroline on Sunshine. They also each had their dolls in front of them, astride their horses, Caroline with Lucy and Grace with Bethany. The two girls' faces were filled with absolute delight as they played together. They had become inseparable, just as she and Eric had hoped from the very first time she had read his post in the Matrimonial Times. "It is so good to see them getting along so wonderfully. It's almost as if they no longer need us oldies around." He put his strong arm around her shoulder, and she leaned into him and snuggled in. "Maybe it is time for us to try for another baby to join our family?" he asked tentatively. She threw her arms around him, squeezing him tightly. Oh, Eric, I would like nothing more. Thank you for making me the happiest woman in the world.